Well, welcome back to Whole Bible Study with me, your host, Tad Inouye. Today, our journey through Exodus brings us to chapter 38, where the focus shifts outside the sacred tent into the courtyard. This is no longer the hidden world of golden furniture and incense clouds. It is the public face of the tabernacle, the place everyone would see and enter. Here, the great bronze altar was built for sacrifices. The basin was set for washing, and linen curtains stacked into the desert soil marked off the boundary between ordinary camp life and holy space. In these details, Israel's worship becomes visible and tangible, shaping not just a theology, but a lived environment. Now, before we begin unpacking the details, let's pause together and hear the chapter itself. So please follow along with me if you wish to Exodus in your Bibles, to Exodus chapter 38, and let's begin reading. They built the altar of burnt offering of acacia wood, 3 cubits high. It was square, 5 cubits long, and 5 cubits wide. They have a horn at each of the 4 corners, so that the horns and the altar were of one piece, and they overlaid the altar with bronze. They made all of its utensils of bronze, its pots, shovels, sprinkling bowls, meat forks, and fire pans. They made a grating for the altar, a bronze network, to be under its ledge. Halfway up the altar, they cast bronze rings to hold the pots for the 4 corners of the bronze grating. They made the poles of acacia wood and overlaid them with bronze. They inserted the poles into the rings so that they would be on the sides of the altar for carrying it. They made it hollow out of boards. They made the bronze basin and its bronze stand from the mirrors of the women who served at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Next they made the courtyard. The south side was 100 cubits long and had curtains of finely twisted linen, with 20 posts and 20 bronze bases, and with silver hooks and bands on the posts. The north side was also 100 cubits long and had 20 posts and 20 bronze bases, with silver hooks and bands on the posts. The west end was 50 cubits wide and had curtains with 10 posts and 10 bases, with silver hooks and bands on the posts. The east end toward the sunrise was also 50 cubits wide. Curtains, 15 cubits long, were on one side of the entrance, with 3 posts and 3 bases, and curtains, 15 cubits long, were on the other side of the entrance of the courtyard, with these 3 posts and 3 bases. All the curtains around the courtyard were of finely twisted linen. The bases for the posts were bronze. The hooks and bands on the posts were silver, and their tops were overlaid with silver. So all the posts of the courtyard had silver bands. And the curtain for the entrance of the courtyard was of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn and finely twisted linen, the work of an embroiderer. It was 20 cubits long, and like the curtains of the courtyard, 5 cubits high, with 4 posts and 4 bronze bases. Their hooks and bands were silver, and their tops were overlaid with silver. All the tent pegs of the tabernacle of the surrounding courtyard were bronze. These are the amounts of the materials used for the tabernacle and the tabernacle of testimony, which were recorded at Moses' command by the Levites under the direction of Ithamar, son of Aaron, the priest. Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, made everything the Lord commanded Moses. With him was Oholiab, son of Ahishmach, of the tribe of Dan, a craftsman and designer, and an embroiderer in blue, purple, and scarlet yarn and fine linen. The total amount of the gold from the wave offering used for the work on the sanctuary was 29 talents and 730 shekels, according to the sanctuary shekel. The silver obtained from those of the community were counted in the census was 100 talents and 1,775 shekels, according to the sanctuary shekel. 1 bekah per person, that is a half shekel, according to the sanctuary shekel, from everyone who had crossed over to those counted 20 years old or more, a total of 603,550 men. The 100 talents of silver were used to cast the bases for the sanctuary, and for the curtain, 100 bases from the 100 talents, 1 talent for each base. They used the 1,775 shekels to make the hooks of the posts, to overlay the tops of the posts, and to make their bands. The bronze from the wave offering was 70 talents and 2,400 shekels. They used it to make the bases of the entrance of the tent of meeting, the bronze altar with its bronze grating and all its utensils, the bases for the surrounding courtyard, and those for the entrance, and all the tent pegs for the tabernacle, and those for the surrounding courtyard. All right, now, so as we return from the reading, the first impression is clear. This chapter is less about artistry and more about structure, less about golden craftsmanship and more about durable materials. Chapter 37 celebrated the gold of the ark and the lampstand, objects tucked away in the inner sanctuary. Chapter 38 shifts to bronze, linen, sockets, pegs, and poles. The vocabulary changes from the language of hidden glory to the language of visible endurance. And that shift matters because it shows us how Israel imagined holiness not only in lofty symbolism, but also in ordinary physical arrangements, measurements, materials, boundaries that everyone could see and participate in. Now, the altar of burnt offering stands at the center of this chapter. In Hebrew, it is the mitzbech aholah. The root of the word mitzbech is zbin, which means to slaughter or to sacrifice. Now, this root appears across Semitic languages. In Ugaritic texts from the city of Ras Shamara, dating to around the 13th century BCE, the verb zabahu is used for ritual sacrifice. This shows us that the Israelites were not inventing a new word from scratch. They shared a broader cultural vocabulary of sacrifice. But what they did with that word is fascinating. In many cultures, altars were fixed stone structures where offerings were made to local gods. Now, Israel, however, made their altar of acacia wood overlaid with bronze, fitted with rings and poles so that it could be carried. The altar was not a permanent landmark tying God to one sacred mountain or city. It was portable, able to travel. That single design choice speaks volumes. Their God was not trapped in geography. He was the God of a people on the move. The size of the altar is given as 5 cubits by 5 cubits. Now, roughly 7.5 feet square and 3 cubits high, about 4.5 feet tall. That makes it large enough to hold substantial sacrifices, but not so tall that the priests could not work at it. Picture it. Picture the structure gleaming in the sun, broad and imposing, yet designed for use by human hands. Now, archaeologists have uncovered altars in Canaan that were made of stone and stood immovably at shrines. At Beersheba, a dismantled 4-horned altar made of stone blocks has been reconstructed, and it looks permanent, rooted. By contrast, Israel's altar was designed to be dismantled and packed up. This was theology embedded in wood and bronze, not bound to one place, but went with his people. Each corner of the altar had a horn called kirin in Hebrew. The horn is one of the richest symbols in the Bible. Literally, it is the horn of an animal, ox or ram. Metaphorically, it came to symbolize strength, honor, and refuge. Now, Psalms 18 calls the Lord, quote, the horn of my salvation, unquote. Hannah in 1 Samuel 2 sings that God raises up her horn, meaning her dignity and power. Later in Israel's history, We even see people fleeing to the horns of the altar of asylum, grabbing them as a last claim to safety. Adonijah, fearing for his life in 1 Kings 1, clings to the horns of the altar until Solomon grants him mercy. That tradition probably grew from the very symbolism we see here. The horns represented strength and divine refuge. To grasp a horn was to grasp hope. That tells us that the altar was not only about sacrifice, it was also about safety. It proclaimed that God's strength could also be God's protection. Now, after the altar, the text describes the bronze basin set between the altar and the tent. And here comes one of the most evocative details in the entire tabernacle account. The basin was made from the mirrors of the women who served at the entrance of the tent of meeting. In the ancient world, mirrors were not glass, but polished bronze. To hand over your mirror meant surrendering something deeply personal. Mirrors were connected with self-image, with vanity, with atonement or adornment. To melt them down into a basin for ritual washing is a transformation of meaning, from looking at oneself to preparing to look towards God. Where once faces were reflected, now hands and feet were washed, cleansed for holy service. Now, scholars like Nahum, Sarna note that this detail quietly but powerfully acknowledges women's contributions to Israel's worship. They were not priests, but their offerings literally formed the vessel for priestly purification. This also connects linguistically to the Hebrew word for basin, kiyor. The kiyor was not a one-time invention. Later, in Solomon's temple, enormous kiyorim called sea basins were crafted of bronze for ritual washing. The continuity of language shows that this was part of Israel's worship vocabulary. The basin in Exodus 38 is a small forerunner of the great vessels of the temple. And the fact that it came from women's mirrors may even symbolize that holiness in Israel was never the monopoly of one gender or one class, but the truth of everyone's offering. From the altar and basin, the text turns to the courtyard. The dimensions are laid out with exact precision, 100 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and with curtains of fine twisted linen hanging on the bronze posts with silver hooks. That's roughly 150 feet by 75 feet, about the size of a small football field. Imagine the sight, white linen shining under the desert sun, a rectangle set apart amidst the dust and chaos of camp life. Anthropologists often note that every society marks off sacred space, whether with walls, fences, stones, or shrines. Israel's choice was linen curtains, stalked with bronze pegs. The effect was powerful. From far away, the camp would have seen a glowing enclosure. Inside that enclosure, ordered rain, altar, basin, tent. Outside lay the noise and dust of ordinary living. The linen boundary created a threshold, a liminal space where one crossed from common ground into holy ground. The fact that the enclosure was made of fabric rather than stone is telling. It was fragile, flexible, portable. It could be taken down and reassembled. The sanctuary was not tied to architecture, but to obedience. This is a theological anthropology. Holiness is not tied to real estate, but to God's presence among his people. The bronze pegs now that held the curtains remind us that holiness is grounded, literally stalked into the earth. It was not a floating idea, but a marked out space hammered into desert soil. At the end of the chapter, we find something unusual in biblical narrative, a careful accounting over a ton of gold, more than 3 tons of silver, 2.5 tons of bronze, a census of 603,550 men is paired with a note that each gave a half shekel. The math is laid out. This is not poetic flourish. It is bookkeeping, and that matters. In the ancient world, temples were often built by kings. Pharaohs inscribed on temple walls how they provided vast quantities of gold and cedar. In Mesopotamia, kings took credit for building ziggurats and temples. In Israel, the story is different. The sanctuary is not funded by a royal treasury. It's funded by the offerings of every household. Each man gave a half shekel, no more, no less. Rich and poor contributed equally. Holiness was democratized. Now, from a historical critical perspective, some scholars suggest that this passage may have been shaped during or after the exile, when the memory of building or rebuilding the temple required communal effort. Richard Elliott Friedman points out that emphasizing shared responsibility would have been especially meaningful when there's no king to pay the bills. Whether it was a historical record from the wilderness or a theological reflection added later, the message is consistent. God's dwelling is established through the shared devotion of the entire people. Anthropologically, this census offering functioned as a unifying ritual. So in societies without centralized taxation, collective offerings served as a form of solidarity. Everyone contributed the same amount, the same small coin, which symbolized equal standing before God. In effect, it was both a spiritual act and a social contract. No one could say, quote, no one could say, the sanctuary is mine because I paid for it, unquote. It belonged to everyone equally because everyone had invested in it equally. The sanctuary itself became a symbol of equality. If we step back and take the whole chapter, what emerges is a picture of sacred space in motion. Bronze, linen, silver, and wood are shaped into a mobile sanctuary that traveled with the people. Theologically, the tabernacle expressed God's transcendence. Gold, hidden inside, untouchable, and God's immanence, bronze, and linen outside, visible, accessible, shared. Anthropologically, it reveals how a community forged cohesion through collective labor and offering. Linguistically, it preserves ancient words like mitzbich, kirin, and kiol, or nekchorchet and bad, tying Israel's worship to its Semitic environment, while also reshaping those terms with distinct meaning. Historically, it sets Israel apart from neighboring nations whose gods were tied to a temple or city. For us today, Exodus 38 presses us to ask, how do we create sacred space? Not only in church buildings, but in our daily lives. Do our courtyards welcome others? Are our offerings transparent and accountable? Do we contribute in such a way that God's presence becomes visible in our communities? The text ties holiness and responsibility and openness. Here is what was given. Here is where it went. That's a model worth imitating. And then there's that unforgettable basin made of mirrors. It asks us, what are we willing to surrender, even from our identity, for God's work, in a world where self-image dominates? The women of Israel gave up the very instruments of self-reflection to create a vessel of purification. What might it mean for us to turn our mirrors into basins, to take something we use for ourselves and transform it into something that cleanses and serves others? Exodus 38 reminds us that holiness is not abstract. It is measured in bronze and linen, in basins and ledgers, in shared responsibility and accountability. The people gave, the artisans built, and God's dwelling became visible in their midst. And so the chapter leaves us with a challenge. What part of ourselves are we willing to offer so that God's presence can be visible in our world today? That's where we'll pause for now. Exodus 38 shows us that sacred space is not built by accident, and it's not built by chosen few. It is the work of a whole people given together. It is the work of a whole people given together. Mirrors turned into basins, bronze hammered into pegs, linen woven into curtains, all transformed by the willingness of a community to make space for God. Thank you again for joining me here on Whole Bible Study. I hope today's journey through the courtyard of the tabernacle has sparked both your mind and your heart. Next time, we'll step into Exodus 39, where the priestly garments are prepared, robes, ephods, breastplates, and turbans, all designed to clothe those who serve in God's presence. It's another chapter that weaves theology into fabric and shows us how holiness touches even what people wear. Until then, may you walk with God, who dwells not only in gold and bronze, but in the offerings of his people. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next study soon.